very much for having me today. I've planned to speak for about 30 minutes, but we can always interrupt in the middle of that, and then um, I can just take longer too, up to you guys. So today I'm going to talk about computational approaches for characterizing culture. And I'm presenting this work, so I'm kind of the mouthpiece of it, but really there's a lot of other people who have supported this and funded this. So um, I do not want to take all the credit here. Okay, so I think at the start here, it's kind of interesting that I'm talking to an AI ethics class for technology leaders because 16 years ago, when I was starting my PhD, I would say, what I was doing, and they'd say, "Oh, what are you doing? Studying programming languages for computer science?" I'd say, "No, I'm looking at AI." And they'd say, "Is that like better spell checking or MapQuest?" Remember MapQuest? Um, and they'd say, "Yeah, good luck getting a job doing that." And then 2013, 5 years later, I defended my dissertation, and people thought AI was just in movies. If I'm building Skynet or something, that's an old Terminator reference from the 90s. And then in 2018, 5 years after that, I was working at SIFT here, and I'd say, well, my research is primarily AI. And they'd say, is that like machine learning? And I'd say yes, because people were starting to talk about AI. And this is only, 6 years ago. And 5 years after that, I'd say, I'm working on a new AI model. And someone else would say, cool, I just asked an AI to help me understand my radiology report. So it really has moved so quickly. And it's just remarkably fast from my perspective. So 16 years ago, it was like a niche science fiction. And now you guys are helping decide how best to assimilate that science fiction into our society. So best of luck to all of us, right? Let's all work together. So today I'll just start by mentioning I'm not an anthropologist. I'm a computer scientist. But if Sonia can talk about AI, I can talk about culture. So I'll talk about what I do here at a small business doing research, and we'll talk about what cultural beliefs are from my perspective as a researcher who is funded primarily by the DoD, and how culture affects those beliefs. And then I'll talk about three different approaches to characterizing culture. One using word embeddings, which is a very sort of geometric way of looking at what beliefs are. Another one is using entailment models to measure agreement with different values to assess things like pluralism. And then we can use LLMs and entailment to extract beliefs from text, and then also measure how those resonate for pluralism. And I hear you guys have already covered some of the topics of value pluralism and such. So I'm going to operate at kind of a moderate level of technical detail here today. Briefly, so I work for a company called SIFT. We've been in business like 24 years. We're based in Minneapolis, and about 2/3 of us have PhDs or masters in science. And just to give you guys an idea of what we do in industrial research is we write proposals to do the research, we team with universities and stuff. Then we do the research, we write papers, we live the dream, and we repeat. Now, the ups and downs of this when you're considering your careers is that, on the plus side, we get evaluated, the businesses, by the quality and the impact of our research. We don't have to sell software, and some of us also teach classes on the side. But the negative side of this is if we're unsuccessful in writing proposals, or if we fall out of relevance, or have trouble finding research money, then we're out of a job. So we don't have the job security of a tenured faculty. So that's kind of what it's like to be a researcher in industry small business. Okay, so as we talk about cultural beliefs here, I'm not going to define this because this is really hard to define, like what a cultural belief is, but let's suffice it to say that many different cultures, meaning over time, over geography, might have different epistemic or patterns of belief. So what I'll do is I'll give you examples of these in here just as a forecast here. So first off, why is it important for cultural beliefs to be understood by machines and by humans? Well, first off, as we might have seen in the news and such in technology news, stereotypes can cause a conflict if they're embodied by an AI or they're exploited by one. Nonverbal actions too can offend in many cultures. So removing your footwear before entering some sort of a room or building, or don't point the soles of your shoes at people, and don't put shoes on a book or a document. And that's just the footwear stuff right there. So there's so many other things that are included in nonverbal, and of course, many more verbal actions as well. But if we don't understand these, we can get into trouble. For example, social institutions and aid programs, such as healthcare, must attend to the beliefs of local folks to earn their trust. As I'm going to talk about a little bit later in maternal and child health, when we apply AI to that domain, we can find the beliefs that breast milk is dirty if it's yellowish, which is at odds with our Western understanding, and bewitchment can cause AIDS, also at odds with our Western understanding. And women make better nurses, which is sort of a bias there and a stereotype. And the whole weird demographic, the Western educated, industrialized, rich and democratic demographic, this is all just a cultural consideration as well. So weird doesn't exist on top or separately from these other beliefs, but it's one of many cultures. And in our pluralism, we have to consider this as perhaps a dominant one, but still one that has to coexist alongside all the other cultural beliefs that may be inconsistent with it. So some cultural beliefs are supported by cause and effect. So it could be that there's a reason that people believe that bewitchment can cause AIDS because of their causality beliefs about muthi and herbs and how that is used for revenge and such on people. Or it could be that some of these beliefs have just become customs to the decades or centuries of tradition, and we've lost the cause and effect of them. So some of these cultural beliefs can be very deep, some can be very cause-free, but they all can be very woven into a society. Okay, so let's get into the computational part now that we've talked about, why cultural beliefs are important for us to model with AI. One of the early approaches that we looked at is using embeddings to look at cultural biases. So embeddings are high-dimensional vector-like representations that most of these large language models use to represent word meaning. The embeddings can be computed on the fly in context, or they can be static, meaning each word has its own embedding. And that's how it was back in 2016 when people were using word2vec, which is kind of an early embedding model. So in this high dimension space, each word has a 1,000, let's say, dimension vector, and that represents or approximates its meaning in some sense. And what we can do is we can use vector math in this high dimensional 1,000 dimensional space to take the words for female, let's say she, her, woman, for example, and then average those, and then subtract the words for male, he, him, man, for example. And then we have the vector pointing from male to female at that point. If we divide that by the vector distance, the magnitude, then we have a unit vector from male to female, into the female direction, basically, from male. That means we can take any word or any other vector and dot product against it to get a single number. And we can average a bunch of words and do that. So if we have a bunch of words, let's say for politics or childcare or workforce or illnesses, then we can actually take a theme and then dot product it onto here to see how male or how female that word or concept is inside our language model. And what's important here is that, folks in 2016, Bullock-Bassi et al. Specifically, they found that a lot of occupation words actually had some extreme components in the female direction or the male direction. So here's some extreme she's. When you take the he to she axis and project all these things, we have like homemaker, nurse, receptionist, etc. And the he's are maestro, skipper, protege, philosopher, captain. So you have more like intellect and leadership over here, which is not true in the world, but it's a stereotype, right? That these are male occupations, but there's nothing precluding, women or non-binary folks from pursuing these occupations, obviously. Unfortunately, though, in these massive models, we can't separate out the fact that architects design buildings from the fact that they are a little more male biased in the meaning, in the vector for these words. So it's all intertwined. And if we want the model to make decisions about who to hire, for example, or the potential gender or sex of an individual here, it could make suboptimal inferences. So noting that it's biased, and it's all biased based on the input data that we train it on, we can actually use these models as a diagnostic. We can see how biased a given city or country is, even in a certain direction, by training a language model and then looking at its vector projections. So for instance, we can project onto the female to male axis, as well as a poor to wealthy axis. And we can see from 1 million US tweets from 2018, how these concepts fall. So here's, a doctor in this space is more, more male and more wealthy. Governor, much more male and wealthy. Unfortunately, student is poor and male. So I guess that's the audience I'm in. But and teacher likewise is not wealthy and female. Now there's no truth to these again, right? They're just how we tend to write, how our country tends to refer to these folks and in what light and with which pronouns. So, and we're also training a whole model that's really getting rid of a lot of variability within our country, right? So we're training a single language model to discard all of those intricacies and summarize it with these single vectors. So that's an important limitation of this work, but we can still make some really interesting predictions and correlations across cultures and across time with this approach. For example, if we take statistics like the United Nations Statistics Division, the World Economic Forum, the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Society, I think it is, or Security, and the World Values Survey, then we can actually correlate with billions of tweets how each country, how their gender biases in language correlate with gender gaps in statistics using this exact approach. So here's an example graph. What you see here is we take politics words such as senator, governor, elect, vote, and so forth, and we project all those politics words on the female to male axis onto our gender axis. And so the x-axis here is the male to female word bias for these politics words, and to the right is more of a female bias. The y-axis here is the Global Gender Gap Political Empowerment Index from the World Economic Forum. And each blue dot here is a country. So as the politics theme increases in female bias, so does women's political empowerment in all these countries. So we can actually take these word embeddings and look at a statistical model or the statistical correlation of how female language bias in politics actually correlates meaningfully with this statistic. Now, this doesn't give us an explanation as to why. It doesn't mean that people prefer, female politicians when they refer to them more, but we do have a statistical interaction that's meaningful here. So this is one graph. And this grid here is essentially each cell is a graph just like that. And we can see how, we have these different statistics along the rows here. We have the World Economic Forum, United Nations, the World Value Survey, and the GIWPS index as well. And what we see here is with things like the political themes, that positively correlates the best with women in ministerial positions, women in parliament, and labor force participation by women. So as these terms get more of a female language bias to them, we see an increased participation, and also you could also say a reduced gender gap in this zone. When the illness terms such as sick and different names of different illnesses actually have more of a female bias, we see a reduction in the Human Development Index for women. in the United Nations statistics. So likewise, we see that these different themes, when they correlate meaningfully with different statistics. The World Value Survey, which we'll talk about later as well, is a bunch of value prompts. So it essentially tests the agreement or disagreement with these different prompts, like when mothers work, children suffer, or men should have more rights to jobs than women. And so as the political theme is more female biased, we see disagreement with men should have more rights to jobs than women. So we see inverse correlations as well. So these are all the R values, not the R squared values. So I hope that makes sense, how we can take, millions of tweets, train these models for each country, and then project those onto these axes. And it doesn't just have to be male to female. You can imagine other sort of binary geometric axes as well for testing this type of bias. We can apply this also not just at the country level, but also at the state level. So this, instead of looking at political words, looks at threatening words like scary, toxic, harmful, etc. And as these terms get a more female bias in US states, we see a gap in census pay equality increase. So here is 70 cents on the dollar that women get paid against men. Here's 90 cents on the dollar, still not too hot, obviously. But, and we can see, Florida, if you're wondering, is right here. So actually higher in the state space. But right, as you see an increase in threatening words having a female component, you see a increased wage gap. Likewise, within our own country's data, we have US statistics from the census, from the CDC for activity proportion, which would be, like exercise that women against men are able to meet those guidelines. And so the health-based indicators correlate inversely with illness, like with infant survival and access to health insurance. So as illness increases in female components, we see infant survival decrease. And likewise, as persistence, like exercise, practice, persist, as all those get more of a female component, we see an increase in the CDC activity proportion for women relative to men. Okay, so that's over different territories such as countries and states, but other researchers have also done the work of looking at this over time. So Garg et al., this is out of Dan Drafsky's lab. They looked at projections not for male to female, but Islam versus Christianity. And instead of, political terms, they actually, for this one, used terrorism terms. And over these years, for each year, they looked at New York Times embeddings instead of tweets. And they found that, the Islam bias towards terrorism terms, that decreases in the early 90s, increases, decreases, and then here's 9/11, a big jump there, right? So we have a bit of a peak, and then we still see into the 2000s sort of a meaningful Islamophobia in the US. Over here, the same authors, they found Asian bias scores. So this is projecting onto Asian names versus traditional white Caucasian names in the US. And these are outsider terms. And so outsider terms like stranger, visitor, foreigner, and such, those had a much more Asian bias early in the 1900s. And then as we have more integration, of course, there's a bump here at World War II. So, and they say that at this point, there were still more, anti-Asian sentiments here in the US, and then it slowly improves. They're also correlating against occupation data. And so with the same white to Asian name axis projection here, you can actually map occupation data. So more people of Asian ethnicity are holding these occupations, and that tracks with the use of language right there. So we can then ask how well these types of embedding approaches can characterize culture. And we can say, I'd argue they're statistically useful. They can relate the way that people use language and statistics that varies over cultures, and how these cultures can even change over time. So they can be predictive. However, they're incomplete, they're not explainable. We're using Twitter and such, and that's, most humans don't tweet and many humans can't read. So we're not hearing those voices. And we can't always tell what the causality is here. Is the male bias of students caused by a cultural preference for educating boys, or is there just more male students worth commenting on, or something else altogether? And these embeddings aren't explanatory. We're blending many perspectives in like one diverse country into one vector. So that's not adequate as a perfect readout. Here's another approach that we can talk about. We're looking at cultural beliefs, and that is using textual entailment. So there's these models called RTE for recognizing textual entailment, or natural language inference, NLI models. You can find them off the shelf and you can retrain them. So that's what we've done here. The purpose of an NLI model is to take two sentences and to classify the relationship of those two sentences. So in the way we're going to use it to assess cultural beliefs, we give it a text and a theme, where the text could be a document like a tweet or a part of a folktale or a part of an interview. And the theme is a concise value or a belief, much like a statement from the World Value Survey, such as men should have more rights to jobs than women, like we saw, right? And then we can see, this model can then predict whether that theme agrees with, is neutral with respect to, or contradicts the text. So that the model is going to give us one of those three answers. So this is useful because, we have a theme such as we should honor our elders. And we can then use our NLP model to predict which of the texts in our big corpus agrees or disagrees with that value. And then we can get a proportion. So we can see how many, or what percent of our texts agree or contradicts that value. And this is much better for small corpora. So we needed millions of tweets to make word embeddings, but we can do this with as few as a handful of documents. All right, so as a proof of concept to show you how this works, we can fine-tune an NLP model using the World Value Corpus, which is a paper out there you can find, and that has a data set for training a model of this sort. So we have the values and the sentences, and we can train a model to recognize agreement or disagreement with cultural values in each sentence. And I love folk tales, I love bedtime stories and all that stuff. So this is three interesting folk tales across the globe here. One of them is about a poor tortoise who has an attractive daughter. This is from Nigeria. And the daughter decides to marry a prince against the wishes of the king. And this brings wealth to her family. So the tortoise and the family is happy that their daughter found affluence. The Kind Hawk is a Native American tale where a boy is actually kidnapped by another tribe, and a hawk rescues the boy, then really treats these kidnappers steals the kidnapper's stuff and revenges against them in a really bad way. So not a very kind hawk in the end, but helps out the boy. And the filial girl, she cares for her parents in Japan. Her mother passes away, and she honors her image in a mirror because she is honoring her deceased mother. So this is honoring the dead and believing in life after death. So we can actually take all of our 242 values from the World Value Survey, and here's the top 25 that you see at left, and we can actually use these with our entailment model. And we have each of the tales that I mentioned listed here as the columns. So we can look at the blue, which is the resonance, or the red, which is the contradictions. And we can see that many of these are actually correct. So family is very important in life. So the tortoise's daughter goes and marries the king's son, and they also value their family a lot. This also says marrying young girls can help provide them security. And there's disagreement with these ideas, like having a son is always better than having a daughter, because it's the daughter who actually brings the family affluence and everything. So it gets plenty of these right, but there's some incorrectness about violence against folks. The kind hawk is about justifying violence. And the filial girl really does accentuate, the fact that the daughter takes care of her parents, and that religion is about life after death more than life, looking at making sense of life as it happens. So a lot of these tend to resonate pretty well in these cultural tales. So we can actually look at these in context. Okay, so this type of an approach, we've used this very broadly, but that was a very simple example there. It's effective at small scale, so we don't need millions of documents. It's explanatory because we can relate directly the sentences and the values in context. But there are some blind spots and some inaccuracies that are inherent in any NLP approach. We also have to provide every single theme a priori. We have to give it to the model because the model is not finding the values or finding the beliefs. It's just sort of triaging everything with respect to the values that we gave it. So this approach isn't going to detect cultural beliefs itself. I'll talk about one more approach here for surfacing and understanding cultural beliefs, and that's to extract beliefs directly using large language models. So here's an interview snippet from with a new mother in Ghana. The witches don't like if you talk about your pregnancy. The pastor told me that the witches had plans to terminate my pregnancy. So he visited my house and we both prayed in order to protect my pregnancy. That's a very serious belief that with fear and protection. So we can use LLMs to extract knowledge graphs to understand the preferences of the witches and the effect of prayer helping pregnancy and pastor as well. And we can also extract the English themes directly. So we can look at values like witches are dangerous, agendas such as I should not talk about my pregnancy, observations, and such as prayer can protect pregnancies and such. So this is one way to actually surface the cultural values or the beliefs directly from text. And then we can use the other approach, the entailment-based approach, to see how well those agree with other parts of the text. So given some corpora, such as an argument or different sides of a situation, we can use a fine-tuned LLM like that to extract those themes and use our entailment model to compute how those agree or disagree with each side of the argument. So here, this is a good sort of use case for healthcare. This is a maternal and child health interview scenario where health attendants, which are the Ashas, and mothers in India are explaining why a mother chose to feed their child colostrum, which is early breast milk, or not feed their child colostrum. They fed cow's milk instead. So for the women that fed colostrum, which is the breast milk, they disagreed with women might not know the benefits of colostrum, and that was agreement with feeding cow's milk. The colostrum is dirty here. That is one reason that women fed cow's milk, but that disagreed with women who fed colostrum. And then we have cow's milk being clean and such, agreeing with both sides. And colostrum is healthy, agreeing with the feeding of colostrum and such, and saving children from disease. So we didn't actually, input any of these values. This was extracted by the LLM and then evaluated by the entailment models. So what we see here is we can look at both sides of the narrative, and we can actually use these values that we extract to explain, this behavior in a very specific cultural scenario. If we also look at how LLMs generate arguments, we prompted a GPT-4 to argue for standardized testing as college admissions or against standardized testing for college admissions. And we can then use the same approach to extract the beliefs and the values, the agendas, and the observations. So for the pro SAT, there was disagreement with standardized tests being outdated, but the anti-testing, that was high agreement of 1.0 proportion, meaning all of them, all these arguments were included that statement here. Likewise, what's important of both of these, though, is there's a basis for agreement of both sides. So in the argument, the LLM arguing pro or anti-SATs and ACTs, both sides agreed that college admissions should be fair and objective, and the tests are somewhat imperfect, right? So there still is a value of fairness that's being voiced, even though we didn't tell the LLM to use fairness to explain this. That's just a value that the LLM is using on both sides of its own argument, right? And likewise, we have agreement on both sides of the colostrum approach here. Okay, so this is effective at a smaller scale. It's explanatory because now we can actually see which beliefs are being extracted. And we can surface beliefs that we didn't walk in with. So colostrum is dirty is actually a very pivotal belief that we didn't know about, but it's able to extract that from these interviews and these narratives. There still are some blind spots, of course. So what we found actually is that some cultural norms are so ingrained that no one talks about them. This is the subtext and not the text. So gender roles and expectations, we might not say, oh, women tend to stay home and do childcare and men tend to go to work. That's not something people say. They just behave in that fashion. And it's not even worth saying oftentimes. And so it could be that embeddings, the first approach, is better for stuff like that. So it's not that one approach is the silver bullet here. It's important at some point that LLMs can understand or emulate different cultures. And so we often want to do this to express or reaffirm cultural values when an LLM chats with a diverse population, or perhaps we might ask an LLM to simulate cross-cultural audience responses if we have a speech or a message that we want to try out, or to ask an LLM what the impact of a decision might make across different nations that are, not weird, so to speak. It might be that the technology is not ready for these types of things, and I don't think it is right now, but these things are already happening. So we should at least prepare and measure how bad the LLMs are at tasks like this. So it's important, if you want the LLM to inhabit or embody different cultures, we have to have pluralism. So that's just to say it has to use a plurality of values and cultures and concepts and explanations. And it could be that these values, these concepts contradict each other. So the belief that, bewitchment can cause AIDS is contradicting the belief in Western medicine that bewitchment doesn't actually exist. But if we can have the LLM inhabit these different cultures and utilize those beliefs, then there's a lot of value to that. And pluralism really is not looking at dominance. So even though one cultural perspective may dominate others in a society, pluralism wants to embody all of them kind of equally. And so the opposite of this is universalism. And you can imagine what a universalist LLM might look like or behave like, which is much more rigid in nature and not able to do any of the above tasks here. Okay, so to assess LLMs for value pluralism, we can give it a prompt, like you are a insert age, year old, insert nationality and gender. So you're a 40-year-old American male participating in an ethnographic interview, and then answer this question. And for that question, we can put in different world value survey questions, such as how would you characterize the role of God in your life and such. And then we can use the entailment model to look at the text that comes out of the LLM and see if it agrees or disagrees with the actual world value survey for that demographic, for that age, and for that nationality, and that sex. So we have the world value survey results for age, nationality, and sex. And so what we can do is, look at the distance or the correlation between the LLM's ability to simulate that demographic and the actual demographic itself. And here's what the results look like when we ran a study like this. Each of these results here is color coded. So the United States is the blue one there, and that has an R squared of 0.8, which is remarkably high. And then it goes all the way down to statistically insignificant with Nigeria here, which is the gray, just down there. And so what this means is that with a high R square, with a high correlation, it shows that the LLM is able to simulate the nuances of that culture very accurately. So when we adjust the age and the gender of the US perspective, it's able to correlate with that very well against what the World Value Survey says. It's a little bit worse when it comes down to other weird cultures, but then once it gets down to Eastern Europe and the African continent, its finger really isn't even on the pulse there, right? So that's not so good. So all right, let's recap now. I'm a little over my time, but cultural values here and beliefs are important for human to human and human to machine interaction. Value pluralism has advantages over value universalism when we're looking at how an LLM should behave. And there's still some open research challenges here. I think the work I've shown today yields more questions than answers, but we want to be able to assess text and media for cultural norms and biases to understand where it comes from and what the subtext is. We want to assess agreement and disagreement and dominance of cultural values in corpora to understand how well this corpus might be received by another culture. And then allowing LLMs to take a plurality of cultural perspectives so they can do some of those important tasks of simulating and interacting with more fidelity. So thanks.